This is Ontario 2020, the Crucible of COVID-19.
Talk about a sight for sore eyes. After 10 long months, hope finally becomes reality as the first COVID vaccine is administered in the province. Thank you so much for joining us on this very special edition of Global News, looking at the COVID-19 pandemic in Ontario.
So much ground to cover, from the provincial handling of the pandemic to the heavy price on health, on business, and life in general.
We don't know for sure when this crisis will end, but we do know it has been a torturous road from last winter right up till today. Let's take a look.
A major development tonight in the international effort against coronavirus.
The outbreak now considered a global emergency.
January 2020, an outbreak in Wuhan, China, raising alarm bells right around the world. The city goes into lockdown, but from this moment on, it was clear no country could ignore what was happening. Coverage of the crisis compounding day by day, just like the virus itself. Novel coronavirus.
Who contracted the novel coronavirus.
Now to the latest on the coronavirus outbreak itself.
The deadly strain of the coronavirus.
The virus so new it didn't even have a name yet, but that too quickly changed. The WHO decided on COVID-19, short for the coronavirus disease 2019.
We had to find a name that did not refer to a geographical location, an animal, an individual, or group of people.
COVID-19 became a stowaway on international flights, quickly spreading to countries around the world. On March 11th, it became clear everyone's life was about to change in ways we couldn't imagine.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
The World Health Organization declares a global pandemic. No region on Earth immune from this rapidly unfolding crisis. Days later, this from the Premier of Ontario.
The government must be in a position to take any and all actions necessary. That is why today, Ontario has declared a state of emergency.
If you want to pick a date, this was when our lives in Ontario turned upside down. Lockdown was here. Cities became ghost towns. Normally crowded streets, empty. Some people, those deemed essential, did go to work. All others hunkered down at home. Everyone in for a steep learning curve, even public health officials.
Putting a mask on an asymptomatic person is not beneficial, obviously, if you're not infected.
But soon our new normal was governed by new rules. Streets were devoid of life, the daily experience filled with uncertainty, fear, and frustration. Then, worst fears became reality. The virus raced through long-term care homes, claiming hundreds of lives.
And then, mercifully, a spring of despair gave way to summer.
I think people are just excited to be out, and I feel like if you look around, people are just happy to be either social distancing with friends or out with their families, so it's nice to see.
It almost felt like the pandemic was over, except it wasn't. By August, fears of a dreaded second wave were growing, and the Ford government was under intense pressure for a safe back-to-school plan.
We are preparing for each and every scenario that can take place. If there is a lesson learned from COVID-19, it's to be ready.
In the end, so many families chose remote learning. Physical distancing became less of a problem at most schools, but then the virus came back with a vengeance, hitting long-term care homes again and industrial workplaces. The province responded with a new color-coded warning framework, and by late November into December, parts of the GTA were plunged into the gray zone. Another lockdown. The timing couldn't have been worse for businesses, large and small, struggling to survive just as the holiday shopping season approached.
It is wreaking havoc on retailers who have already absorbed the most difficult year in history.
At the same time, the race for COVID vaccines begins to pay off.
Hopefully it'll help other people to come along and do as I did.
90-year-old Margaret Keenan of the UK becomes the world's first person to receive a COVID vaccine outside of clinical trials. The world is buoyed by the news, but distribution will be an enormous undertaking around the world.
For military precision, Ontario hires former Chief of the Defence Staff Rick Hillier.
Our mission is really clear for us. We want to run an efficient and equitable COVID-19 vaccination program for Ontario in order to provide every eligible person in the province with the opportunity to voluntarily get vaccinated against COVID-19.
That's what we all want. Time will tell how it goes and when we can return to something like normal. Now, anything resembling normal is still a long way off. And Alan, getting that vaccine, as we mentioned, to nearly 15 million people across the province is going to be a mammoth job, incredibly complex.
And the buck is going to stop with the Ontario government and Doug Ford in particular. Let's take a look at Doug Ford's performance over the course of the pandemic in 2020. Travis Naresh is, of course, our Queen's Park Bureau Chief. And, you know, Travis, the Premier has enjoyed some really positive and strong polling numbers, but you think back to March and it did not start that well in terms of communications for Doug Ford.
No, it did not, because he told everyone, if you remember back in March, to go on their March break. And a lot of people, including myself, did do that. And a lot of people had to rush back when the lockdown was imposed. You know, certainly the Premier has been very visible during the past several months, and that has won him, you know, a lot of good points with many people when it comes to the polls. I think, you know, at the beginning he was hovering around 80% approval rating. Now that's down into the 60s, but people have felt some reassurance seeing the Premier out every day in front. That does not necessarily mean, though, there haven't been missteps. You guys just did a pretty good job, you know, recapping some of what has happened, but there has been missteps with long-term care when it comes to messaging as well. You'll remember, you know, he told everyone, don't go up to your cottages, and then he went to his cottage. He said, you know, everyone stay in your bubble for Mother's Day, and then he had, you know, family members at his home. But overall, the Premier has been out in front, and I think that that has given a lot of people some reassurance that there is someone in charge of the plan moving forward.
You know, this has been such a transformational time in society, and it seems, Travis, that the Premier has changed in a way as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, there will be people that parse whether or not he has really changed, but we have seen definitely a change when it comes to tone sometimes. You know, the Premier never thought he would be in this situation. They had an agenda when they came to power in government. It was not to deal with a global pandemic. And certainly the Premier didn't think he would be in this situation, but he has been dealing with this. And certainly I think that that has humbled him, and you know, he is someone that is able to communicate kind of with the everyman, and that voice that he has to speak plainly has served him well during this pandemic because he is able to get that message out. Now, I mentioned some of the communication blunders when it comes to messaging, but certainly the Premier has been taking calls from, you know, small businesses and things like that, and I really do think that he does empathize when he has to make some of these big decisions, including, you know, putting folks into the gray zone or lockdown, you know, and bringing them out. So I think that certainly, you know, the Premier has been communicating, and he has been doing a good job of that. It's going to be scaled back for the time being, though.
You know, so much of us, you know, our jobs have changed. Farah, you spent a good portion of 2020 broadcasting from your backyard or your garage, for example. Just the business of bringing the news and the stories about COVID, it changed so much. Can you talk a little bit about those daily press conferences from Doug Ford and how that works from a journalist point of view?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because, I mean, this was not the situation that we thought would happen, that we would be in our homes and calling in to ask the Premier questions every single day. But that is what it has been since March, and the Premier has made the conscious decision to be out there every single day. Obviously, over the past couple of days, he has said now that he is going to scale back a bit, but he still will be present, whether or not that's photo ops or what have you. But when we dial in, it is up to the Premier's office to take a certain amount of calls, because obviously there are a lot of journalists that have questions, and that has created some question marks about whether or not they're picking and choosing who they're taking questions from. But I will say this, the Premier has been there. He has been answering questions and facing fire every single day when it comes to pretty tough questions. And he's been answering them to the best of his ability. We will see, what happens in the next little while with communications, but it's left your head spinning what has happened over the past couple of months. When our producer asked me to do this year-ender, I said, where do you start? And I guess we started with the lockdown in March, and we are now to the point where we're going to be seeing that light at the end of the tunnel, that vaccine coming to be distributed across the province very soon.
Yeah, still a lot of questions for the government and what's happening behind the scenes. So we know you'll stay on top of that. Thanks so much for that, Travis.
Well, just ahead, a shot in the arm, what exactly that vaccine is doing when it enters your body. We're going to take a deeper dive in the actual science with a leading infectious disease specialist. Plus,
I was scared when the fever spiked.
You know him as Global's chief meteorologist, but Anthony Farnell also has a harrowing story to tell about this dreaded virus. We have that and more straight ahead. Please stay with us.
I've been back from Austria for 2 days. I realized it wasn't jet lag anymore, and it wasn't just tired legs from skiing in powder. This was something bigger.
Everyone knows that guy, but you might not know that Anthony Farnell had his own encounter with COVID-19.
A ski trip to Austria went from fun to frightening very fast. In late February, as the entire world was waking up to this emerging crisis, Anthony was waking up to some pretty disturbing symptoms.
Shortness of breath, fever, a loss of smell and taste. He immediately went for a test, which wasn't easy to get in those early days.
The results took almost 72 hours to get back to me. And when I first found out that I had COVID, it was a phone call, quickly followed up by Toronto Public Health. And the first thing going through my mind is, okay, I have this highly contagious virus. What do I do to protect myself and those around? And then the whole tracing starts, where you're on the phone, you're trying to look back at memories and maybe any receipts that you have of the places you had been in the last, in my case, almost 10 days, trying to figure out who I had been in contact with and potentially infected, which I'm hoping and thankful, I think, that nobody got it because of me.
Turns out Anthony was one of the first 100 confirmed cases of COVID-19 here in Ontario.
And since then, about 150,000 other people in this province have received the same diagnosis. The virus has claimed more than 4,000 of those lives.
And that's where the vaccines come in. Of course, they are liquid gold, our best shot at actually ending this pandemic. But how do they actually work once inside your body?
Earlier, we spoke with Dr. Isaac Bogosh, infectious disease specialist and member of Ontario's Vaccine Distribution Task Force. Dr. Bogosh, what happens inside the human body once the vaccine is administered?
This is really interesting. So with this mRNA technology, what happens is you get your vaccination and the mRNA goes into your cell, and it basically tells your cell to make something. And that something that it's going to make is going to look like a small component of the virus. So the mRNA goes into the cell, and then it just degrades. It completely disintegrates, and your cell makes something that looks like a little component of the virus. Then your body recognizes that and says, okay, there's something that looks like a virus. It's not the virus. It just looks like the virus. And your immune system says that's not part of you, and your immune system attacks it. And your immune system remembers exactly what that looks like. So if later on you're exposed to the virus, your immune system will say, oh, I've seen that before, and it will go attack the virus, and it will actually prevent the virus from getting inside your cell. So that's how it works.
So the Pfizer vaccine is out, and we know more are on the way. Once they're approved, other than being different, with cold storage and that sort of thing, do these other vaccines work any differently at all than Pfizer?
Well, it's interesting. There's the Pfizer vaccine, which, as you point out, is approved. And the other vaccine that hopefully will be approved very soon is the Moderna vaccine, which works in a nearly identical manner than the Pfizer vaccine. And as you point out as well, the only real difference is it's a little more durable, so you don't need to store it in as cold of temperatures, and it's probably a little bit more portable than the Pfizer vaccine. The other vaccines that are under consideration by Health Canada take a completely different approach. And those are really aligned with other types of vaccines that we see. For example, the Influenza Vaccine. So these are either weakened viruses or killed viruses, essentially, that are delivering the vaccine to us.
So is there consensus on which kind is better?
At this point in time, it's not quite clear. Certainly, certain vaccines have pros and cons. Now, we've heard about the pretty impressive efficacy that the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine have. It's not entirely clear what the efficacy is of the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, so we're not entirely clear. The AstraZeneca vaccine is really inexpensive compared to the other one, so that can be extremely helpful. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is helpful because it's a single dose, whereas all the other ones that are under consideration by Health Canada are two-dose series. So there's definitely pros and cons with each one of these vaccines. I think at the end of the day, we need something that is, number one, going to prevent us from getting this infection. Number two, if we do get this infection after having a vaccine, hopefully it will mitigate the severity of the infection. And number three, we need something that's obviously very, very safe. So if we can really ensure that the vast majority of Canadians choose to get these vaccines and have a safe and effective product, I think we'll be doing something good.
Some great information there. Dr. Bogosh, as always, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Just ahead, the high cost of COVID.
We do believe that there are safe ways to allow smaller firms to continue to serve customers without shutting them down 100%.
Ontario business is barely hanging on. What can be done to help them while keeping everyone safe? That story after the break.
There will be, in January, there will be a level of economic carnage the likes of which we have never seen.
That's Heather Eastman, the CEO of Indigo, expressing the fears and frustrations of businesses right across the province.
Efforts to contain COVID-19 have led to restrictions and lockdowns that have taken a terrible toll on companies large and small.
And remember, for every business that disappears, so do many jobs. Morgan Campbell has that part of our coverage.
This is one of the busiest times of the year for shopkeepers in Bloor West Village. On a normal year, you would find people wandering up and down the streets, in and out of stores. As you can see, it is a much different scene this year.
Sizing outside in the freezing cold isn't ideal. Also, it's not that personal, touch where you can look at everything we have to offer.
Bianca Charles owns and operates the Feet First Clinic in the village. Since the beginning of the pandemic, she has watched the area lose at least a dozen businesses due to provincial lockdown measures. The 6 weeks leading up to Christmas is the most important time for retailers. In that span, they bank enough cash for the shoulder season, which usually lasts until March. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business has questioned the Ford government's move to shutter businesses in urban areas in lockdown, such as Toronto, Peel, and York Region.
We've got to find a better pathway. We do believe that there are safe ways to allow smaller firms to continue to serve customers without shutting them down 100% to in-store traffic. We've recommended to governments that they have a small business first policy.
You can look to Alberta in the west and Nova Scotia to the east to find examples. Those provinces are limiting the number of customers per store, while in Quebec the formula is based on square footage. Projections put forward by the CFIB suggest Canada will lose 160,000 businesses by the end of the pandemic. To really put that into perspective, that kind of loss will impact 1 in every 7 businesses. In an effort to survive, many businesses have had to move online.
These are stores that are closing, putting people out of work. And that's going to hurt them, obviously, their families, and it hurts the economy as well when these people are not working and they become more dependent on social assistance.
Business owners have been left to wonder what the retail landscape will look like post-pandemic.
It will be interesting to see how many people actually can withstand this particular closing and in general of the whole pandemic that we've been going through.
Morgan Campbell, Global News.
Just ahead, every picture tells a story, capturing the impact of this pandemic one photograph at a time. That and more after the break.
Since a state of emergency was declared, frontline healthcare workers and others have carried an enormous responsibility,
putting themselves at risk while attending to the sick and consoling those facing other challenges.
Catherine Ward has put together this collection of thoughts and memories from those on the front line.
At that point, it was the Pandora's box opening up.
My most memorable COVID patient is actually a couple. They had done everything right. They never went outside, they had their groceries delivered, and yet he started having symptoms first, and she got very short of breath.
She was here in Canada finishing her studies from Italy, and back in Italy her mother had just died from COVID.
Many of the residents were at high risk of developing serious illness from COVID-19.
My 4-year-old patient was very healthy before he got COVID, and even during the illness remained quite healthy. His mom called me. She was admitted to hospital on oxygen, doing quite poorly, and she was 5 months pregnant at the time.
I think of one young person in particular who was struggling, who was just getting by when everything shut down in March.
That first projection I made with no definite maximum was frightening.
We did all the things we could to keep him alive, to make him better.
She was huffing and puffing and couldn't really get many words out, asking me how to keep her unborn baby safe and her child safe.
Sadly, the demons of mental illness and the dangers of addictions conspired that this young person died.
That's our look back at 2020 here in the province, a year none of us will ever forget.
We leave you now with a collection of photographs. Each one tells a different story during this crucible of COVID-19 in Ontario.